the session? Yes. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I have quite a few topics to cover this morning, so I'm going to get started right away. But first, I'd like to introduce my guide on the site this morning, which is Dr. Gail Ring, who is the Director of Educational Partnerships with me at PebblePad. I'm an implementation specialist at PebblePad, but also a faculty at Portland State University, a former faculty administrator for community colleges and universities in the state of Oregon. So I think you'll find out a little bit more about the work that I've done in the last 25 years while we go through the topics today. But without further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screens because we have quite a bit of territory to cover. Please,
can I just interject 1 second?
Yes.
I'm already taking over and I apologize. If you have questions, just pop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. We may take, a minute throughout if there's a lot of questions and, kind of take a pulse and see how everything's going. But for the most part, we're going to leave everything until the end.
And I think too, as I'm getting started here, it would be lovely if you would drop into the chat where you're at, potentially your role. And if you have any burning, pressing topics that you hope to see today, because if they aren't included, the likelihood that we could at least talk cognizantly about them is pretty high. So please feel free to enter your information for the rest of the attendees. Networking is one of the nicest things that I've seen go on at this very collegial open conference. And so I'd like to continue that this morning during the presentation. Thank you. So we're going to talk about practices that can enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion in online settings. And I am Dr. Melissa Shaquid Pirie, and of course, Gail is with me today. And what we're going to talk about today are practices at scale. So we're going to talk about some practices that are individual to you as an educator, practices that could be employed at the course level, at a program level, and at a degree level. So we're going to be looking at various scales of a kind of conundrums, which is not my favorite word, but context, and then also some solutions for approaching equity, inclusion, and diversity in some substantially effective ways in our online settings. So let's get started. And I think I'll start with an individualized practice. So here is a draft from one of my announcements this term. I teach in the master's program, post-secondary adult and continuing education in the College of Education at Portland State University. And one of my forward-thinking practices with students is to acknowledge when things do not go well in the online setting. So I have coined a term, magnificent failures, from a student who's a CTE senior online learning assistant at, I think, McMaster. Isn't that true, Gail?
No, it's at the University of Waterloo.
University of Waterloo.
Close, same proximity.
Where we're currently working on implementation of a platform there, PebblePad. And Kylie Miles came in and discussed as a student her portfolio, and one of her tabs in the portfolio was magnificent failures. I have never let go of that. And so when I fail to meet my own standards in the course, I like to right away acknowledge that. And as you can see here in my message to my students in my fully online course, the 4 things that I rely on heavily in online environments are engagement, acknowledgement, adaptability, and flexibility. Acknowledging when things do not go well is one of the most clear kindnesses I think we can offer to our students. So I'll start off with a self-effacing message right away this morning, right? A magnificent failure is a lovely thing to share with our students because it grants us all the opportunity to have that special experience. So now that I've talked a little bit about just my own personal approach, those 4 components that I think are most important in online teaching, I want to talk a little bit about the geographic landscape that we are currently functioning under. These 2 images here are actually maps of milliseconds of internet activity. The map on the left was generated in 1999. It's the Cheswick Internet Mapping Project, one of the first to be undertaken. And the image on the right is a 2014 map, a millisecond of internet activity. Why I like to show these images is because I think about the digital landscape as a geographic place we are actually going on a daily basis in order to manage our teaching and learning experiences. But it's also a place where we go constantly to manage our personal and professional and lives outside of just our academic work. So I like to show these images of the geographic landscape because we're going to continue to talk about this place that we go to today together. And I think representing this landscape to your students is an important part of the context under which we are learning. Having them understand this landscape as a place that we go and some of the contextual factors that are present in it that absolutely impact our learners and us as educators is something that I think we should grant the opportunity for our students to have a conversation with us about. So this geographic landscape is something that is mentioned. You're going to see a lot of resources today, a lot of resources from me in a book that came out in 2014 called Information Doesn't Want to Be Free: Laws for the Internet Age. This is by Dr. Cory Doctorow, and it was an exceptional look at some of the laws and policy that actually support or do not support us in these digital landscapes where we are arriving every day to meet our students. So I do recommend that you take a look at this book, but since you likely have not seen it, I want to pay attention to 4 key roles that Dr. Cory Doctorow says we play in this digital landscape at all times. And so I hope that you are situating yourself in this context as I'm speaking with you today. Dr. Cory Doctorow says there's essentially 4 roles. You are either a creator of original work that goes into that landscape. You are an investor, which means that you have capital involved in the actual delivery of the internet and what goes on in it. You're an intermediary company. So this is a distributor like YouTube, Amazon, cable, but also our learning management system platforms, our ePortfolio platforms, our student information systems are all intermediary companies. And then also an audience member. If you're an audience member, you're also most likely a creator or vice versa. So when we think about the roles that we are participating in and the roles that our students are participating in, I want you to keep those in mind as we continue on with the conversation about this digital landscape we're teaching in. But I also want to make note that you may have immediately disinvested yourself from the role of investor. But the reality is our tax-paying dollars pay for the public and private infrastructure that goes into providing the internet for us to teach in. And that our schools are always spending state, private, public, and for-profit funds to invest in platforms that do manage the type of policy and law that we are participating with when we are utilizing the intermediary platforms that are completely managing our online experiences with our students. So those 4 roles relate to an activity that I often have scholars participate in. And I think it's important for us when we're thinking about the digital landscape that it lives everywhere and yet nowhere in terms of responsibility in our curriculum. If we are so lucky, we have a beautiful central teaching and learning support system, and we have instructional designs to also support us. But our understanding of our digital ecosystems and our scholars' understanding of their digital ecosystems are often disparate. So what I like to encourage my students to do when they enter a program, so this would be, you could do this at the course level, absolutely, but when they enter a program as well, to think about where are they actually going online? What systems are you using when you go into this digital landscape? What do you do when you're in those systems? How often do you go there? Who's there with you? And very importantly, who manages the content, storage, and recall of the type of work that you participate in or invest in those systems? You know, we think a little bit here, and this question always about social media, right? What happens to something that you put out there? Are you able to recall it at will? And do you own it in perpetuity? And then another really important part of the conversation, and I think our central teaching learning units and our IT departments are thinking about this constantly, how do these systems that we're utilizing interact with one another and communicate with one another? And is that to our benefit or our detriment? So this mapping digital ecosystems activity is a highly recommended part of helping scholars think about the context under which they are learning, and you as well. So here's an image. Again, here we're going to go back to that 1999 map, right? That digital ecosystem, that 1 millisecond of activity. And in this digital world, we have our own personal digital ecosystem, and our organizations have their own ecosystems as well. And we've tried very hard in the last 15 years as institutions to support our learners in this digital landscape. but the power dynamic has become dangerously imbalanced by the ownership, organization of, subsequent loss of learning spaces across intermediate platforms like LMS systems. They serve an essential purpose, but as we become more and more helpful with these systems that we procured to support our learners, we may have been creating a generation of digitally helpless learners with very to little, no power in these digital ecosystems that we control and maintain. So I'll encourage you during this conversation today to think about the digital spaces you utilize with your learners, and do they provide equal digital power, control, and privacy, right? So that's something I want you to be thinking about when you think about all the locations that you're currently managing your educational experiences for your learners with. PebblePad, of course, I want to be very transparent, is the platform that I work for, but it's also the platform that's centrally supported by Portland State University and a dozen other universities. And so that's an important part to me in my digital ecosystem that offers equity to our learners because it is privately owned and controlled by the learner as a gift from the institution. So let's take a look at how an organization is representing their digital ecosystem to their own faculty, staff, administrators, and their students, right? And I want to call out this beautiful example from Kwantlen Polytechnic University. This is their learning technology ecosystem. They have taken the time as a collective to take a look at the tools they have in use and then make sure that the system functions are appropriate, that they are noted if it is centrally supported or if it's an ad hoc or standalone. Are you on your own using this technology? Does it have digital ethics considerations? Have they been vetted? Is there learner equity involved in any of these platforms? Is there appropriate supports for both the faculty and the learners with all of these systems? And are they aligned with the core foci of the campus? You can see that for them, a large part of their focus is 21st century learning skills. And I want to expose you to what I think is a really solid example of understanding the digital ecosystem and its implications for faculty and learners, which is, of course, a very important part of equity. So we think about these cultural and societal landscapes, right? And we've been wanting to adjust them for the better for a long time. We utilize our academic freedoms, publications, and research in our specific disciplines that require our dedication and attention. We have equitable and ethical choices to consider every single time our learners go in that digital landscape. In the same way that we work to create safe spaces in our classrooms, we want to be able to do that online. We want to be able to foster those safe spaces there. So with infrastructure and pedagogy, we can kind of shift that digital power dynamic to try and achieve real learner equity. And we're going to look at examples of that today. What we know about transformational learning is that it requires individual reflection, rooted in the understanding of power structures and public concerns, and also that secondary layer, which is the peer discourse for sense making and expansion of understanding other ways of knowing the world and experiencing the world around us through our own social identities that are varied from the ones we have. So I want that to occur for my students, and I want that to occur for myself in the safest place possible. So let's take a look at some of the strategies for that. I want to introduce you to a concept you have likely heard before, but digital citizenship, right? So that is continuously developing norms of appropriate, responsible, and empowered technology use. This is an up and coming practice in our K-12 systems. I worry sometimes that our students are going to arrive at our doorstep in higher ed with a much stronger understanding than we actually have around the tenets of digital citizenship. And I thought I would share some of those with you here this morning. So this is a book that has recently come out, my colleague, Mike Ribble and Marty Park. And this is the Digital Citizenship Handbook for School Leaders. And I highly recommend it, but I wanted to show it to you because we're going to take a look now at some of the components. So in the book, they say that there are 9 tenets for digital citizenship. Those are along the right-hand side of the slides here. That those 9 tenets fit into 3 components of the S3 model. The S3 model means safety, savvy, and social. If you take a look at the components that comprise this particular set of elements, you'll see that we most often don't start with safety. Our students are starting with social. They're becoming savvy, but they don't always understand what it is they need to maintain safety, equity, and privacy and security in these online spaces. So the lower three on the right-hand side of the slide, that digital law, digital rights and responsibilities, that digital security and privacy, is something that I think we have not approached very effectively with our scholars as a whole in higher education, because we've been responding to this massive shift to remote and online learning. I think it's time for us to think about it a little bit more critically. There is a link here on the lower right hand of the side that has these digital citizenship resources and excellent rubrics for you to evaluate your own communication around digital citizenship and digital landscapes with your students. But what we know from the book and from these digital landscapes and citizenship tenets is that we need our students to be aware of digital ethics, their personal, organizational, national, and international ethics, the digital geographies they go in, the policy and law, their access and equity, thinking about things like digital colonialism and surveillance capitalism, which we will take a look at here. So just for a tiny little mind-blowing moment, I'm putting this very old table that I created based on the book, Information Doesn't Want to Be Free, Laws for the Internet Age. If you have ever wondered if we are fully protected in our most fashionable form online, I would encourage you to not forget this part of the presentation. The laws that support and do not support us in the United States today in 2022 are actually the adoption of laws from 1893. And the last time those laws that protect or don't protect us online related to intellectual property were ratified were in the early 2000s. So we've been functioning for almost 2 decades without updated laws around the type of rights and responsibilities we have to security and privacy in the spaces where we are now fully delivering degree program experiences to our scholars. So in these online spaces, because we lack a lot of law and policy to support our privacy, security, and our intellectual property in these spaces, we are now experiencing what we call digital colonialism. This is the deployment of imperial power over a vast number of people without their consent. And that is their dominant powers in the intermediary companies that are managing our education alongside us at all times. And that we want to make sure that anyone who has access to the internet can create, innovate, or collaborate without maximizing the wealth of another person. And that means our organizations as well. So when we think about digital colonialization, it's a current reality. These are some clips that have come off of the news in the last few years. And my favorite part of this is that it says the next continent to emerge will not be the moon or Mars or an asteroid. It's going to be on the internet. And it is true that all of the spaces that we inhabit are often being monetized. Our behaviors are being monetized for the benefit of others. And I think that's something that we want to be considering at all times when we're sending our scholars out into that digital landscape. In relation to this idea of digital colonialism, I am going to recommend today 3 excellent books that are very recent. So Dignity in a Digital Age, which is Ro Khanna, who is a Silicon Valley member of Congress now. Street Data, the Next Generation Model for Equity, Pedagogy, and School Transformation. Amazing book. And then Good Data, this idea of social data and transformation. So these 3 readings are directly related to this idea of digital colonialism and dignity in digital environments, including equity, inclusion, and diversity. So now we're kind of moving along the line of these concepts into some actual functional strategies that we can apply. So because we have these coalescing digital lives, you do, I do, our students do, we have these personal, geographic, organizational, digital ecosystems that are constantly overlapping one another. And we hope that our students have this lens of digital citizenship to protect them in these spaces and to provide them with the most information that they can get around how they are navigating their identities and their signature work in these spaces. So because we have that coalescence happening, how are we actually going to go about providing some equity for our learners in these spaces? So let's take a look at some ideas. So here we are again in that equitable landscape. And the concerns in that landscape are that there's a power imbalance, as I mentioned earlier, right? For many years now, and this is no surprise to people who have had to try to recall work for learners out of learning management systems, The access to our learners' own work that they have submitted and the feedback that they give on it often disappears from them. And if they don't understand their responsibility to their own creative work, surfacing their learning, collecting, organizing, curating their learning for future showcasing, then we aren't really doing them many favors in terms of the power imbalance. Also, we are subjecting them to increasingly more locations in that digital landscape, but they're receiving less training and support. There is, of course, this idea that technical expertise has increased in an autonomous way, that many of our learners arrive and don't complain about the systems that we have them work in, need less and less support because they are increasingly more competent. But we also have a whole generation of learners who do not have those competencies, and we cannot pretend that they do. So that privacy and security in the higher ed tech systems, the assessment of those and acknowledging whether or not we have those in the systems that we're using, this idea of managing our scholars' learning in a panopticon that we control, and the ownership and control of those spaces, and limited interoperability or interoperability that compromises their sense of personal safety and security around their own signature work are concerns that we need to address. So how do we mitigate these? Well, I am very proud to have Gail with me today. We've spent the last 5 years shoulder to shoulder supporting practices at dozens of institutions at a global scale. And what we have learned from them are some of the things I'm going to share with you today. So co-creating learning and outcomes. There's a link here for you to dig into what the University of Edinburgh, the University of Washington are doing, or Waterloo, excuse me, are doing in terms of co-creating an active learner involvement in the design and development of education. These are called student-led, independently created courses. I highly encourage you to take a look at this 45-minute webinar discussing what I think is an amazing set of power, equitable, dynamic practices that they have put in play. I also want to encourage you to think about the opportunities for self-grading with your students in these online environments. There's a session link here for Dr. Vicki Rettenauer, Portland State. She has been for a decade or more now participating with self-grading and revising those processes for learner equity. The way in which she discusses the process of self-grading and the equity involved in it is potentially one of the most beautiful things I've seen in the last year. It's a 30-minute session, and I encourage you to take a look at it. So mitigating through some of these suggestions coming forward. If at the end of this, while we're having our discussion, you want me to come back and talk about any of the components of the student-led independently created courses or the self-grading process, Gail and I would be happy to answer those questions for you. In addition to co-creating learning and outcomes and self-grading, I want to say synchronous video conferencing prior to the COVID outbreak was something that was hotly debated and is still hotly debated. I am putting a link here to my recent article on leveraging video conferencing, synchronous video conferencing and fully online degree programs. These degree programs were co-developed and designed by myself and colleagues at Portland State University and the School of Business. We supported the design of it, of course, with Quality Matters and by accessing resources from the Online Learning Consortium. But one of the most important parts of having an equitable relationship with our students in these fully online degrees we felt were synchronous video conferencing opportunities. And you can see some quotes on the right-hand side from the type of engagement we were having with our students. But I want to say that explicitly stating that digital skills and digital video conferencing, networking, communicating, and holding yourself accountable for not only the content of the course, but the academic integrity of what it is you're learning is an essential skill that does provide equity to our learners in these online spaces. So that's my plug for synchronous video conferencing and the benefits that I reaped from participating in it and the faculty that participated in this. And please do later take a look at the link and take a look at their quotes, the student quotes there. Is a really amazing opportunity that I don't think we should miss with our students if we can afford to participate in them. So other strategies for diversity and inclusion in higher education. The next set of examples that I'm going to show you represent a series of opportunities for our scholars to represent their perceived social identities. This is a very carefully selected term. How they perceive themselves and how others perceive them. How do we in online settings invite the whole life of our learner into their education, right? One of the questions I use to frame this concept is, how much do we expect or anticipate our learners to be changed by the culture of the academy when they arrive? And how are we soliciting the lives of our learners to then change that academy once they arrive? So some of the practices we're going to take a look at here are generative knowledge interviewing, autoethnography practices, my absolute fave of all time, storytelling, and some high impact practices for transformational learning. So I mentioned earlier, high impact practices that include things that support individual reflection, surfacing of individual experience and newly found knowledge, and then also offering opportunities for peer to have discourse over their own aha moments around their own social identities, equals transformational shifts in knowledge in an online setting. So we're going to take a look at some examples of that. So generative knowledge interviewing, this is Dr. Melissa Peet, also came up through Portland State University. We'll talk a little bit about maybe why Portland State University is so innovative in a few moments, but she's the founder of generative knowledge interviewing. And here's a lovely quote from Dr. Jeff King, who is in the Transformational Teaching and Learning Center, Central Oklahoma. But generative knowledge interviewing is a process by which students talk with one another about their lived experiences. And as you can see here, for first generation students or students who are underrepresented, it's a really, as he mentions, extraordinary thing to witness. It's also a very interesting thing to participate in. My experience with generative knowledge interviewing began in my undergraduate degree and extended into my master's and my doctoral programs. All were facilitated by a colleague of Dr. Peet's who really believed in this process. I now use it with my students, and I highly recommend you take a look at this process and how it can potentially be employed in your fully online programs. There is a little link here in the lower right-hand corner. So in addition to generative knowledge interviewing, I want to also talk about, excuse me, my slides are going a little bonkers here, autoethnography as a pedagogical approach to storytelling culture. So for those of you who have not yet bumped up against the process of autoethnography or the description of it, right? It has sought to reposition and resituate unheard voices in ways that reveal people's lived experiences in sociocultural contexts. So it's provided a narrow but solid pathway for stories of socially marginalized to enter into the discourse of academia. As I was mentioning earlier, how are the lives of our learners impacting the way in which we deliver and understand academia? So autoethnography lends itself to these critical perspectives that address how power and privilege play out in the social personal lives of our learners and how those entities are reproduced as well as potentially resisted. So deeply personal accounts of race, gender, culture, language, other aspects of our scholars' identity really powerfully illustrate how people live with and through privilege and marginalization every single day. Autoethnography has the learner as the self, as the site of inquiry. And reflection can often be extremely narcissistic, as it should be, essentially, right? But what we want to do is have our scholars think about themselves in relation to larger cultural, social, and political constructs, and be able to relate their experience to those constructs, to one another, to understand the variances in the way in which we all experience similar political, cultural, and social power structures. Let's dig into this a little bit more. So how do our lived experiences connect to shared structures? How would you actually implement this in a classroom? I have this set up in the gradation, right? And I know this takes me back to the Bush days, right? Are we on yellow, orange, or red today? But I think that I like to start with my learners in terms of autoethnography, like any safe space, at a lower stakes storytelling process, right? I remember one of the questions that I asked Gail when we first met one another was, what was her experience with a laundromat? Does that sound crazy, Gail? Do you remember this? And I wanted to know, what's your experience with a laundromat? Some of the questions that I ask my students are that simple. How do you experience public transportation? In a class of 30 students, you will have someone who potentially has never been on it. I've heard stories where the example of public transportation, and I have permission to share this with you, is that a young woman was on the bus with her mom so that her mother could give birth to her brother. Her mother was 17 years old. She was 4, right? So we all have these different experiences related to these social structures that we have, and sharing those stories with one another at a lower level Have you been to a laundromat? How do you experience public transportation? Those sorts of things set the tone for our scholars to begin to share with one another their lived experiences in relation to these lower power structures. But then you can increase the stakes, especially in a cohort situation, but also as the students go through their degree program and develop their skills around critical thinking, equity, social identity, race, social justice, those sorts of things, they become more adept at articulating their relationship to these power structures. So then you can increase the stakes by including larger and more powerful structure and the impacts of those with your scholars. And then I see at the capstone level, at the general education program level at university studies, after a year, 1 year of training, support, facilitation for reflection, integrative learning, digital identity, they move into these really complicated layers of control and power. How do state policy and law affect them? How does immigration law affect them? How does the power structure around even just the digital landscape and access impact them, right? I have a Native American scholar who has no access to internet on her reservation. How is that very different from my inner city student who has free wireless on the campus? So these are the ways in which I encourage you to start thinking about creating community and opening up the equity dialogue amongst your students using autoethnography as a pedagogical approach. I'm about to share with you now a chapter that Gail and I had the distinct privilege of co-authoring this last year. So from the upcoming book chapter, Leveraging a Campus Equity Walkthrough Evaluation, ePortfolio, to assess first-year students' equity-minded learning and campus belonging. This will be coming out and creating global citizens through high-impact practices in education, and it will be part of the series Innovation in Higher Ed Teaching and Learning. So the citation's there. It's not quite available yet, but I am going to talk a little bit about what comprise the components of this chapter, because I think it's one of the most excellent types of equitable practices I've seen in a while. So the campus equity walkthrough evaluation, does it seem silly that I'm talking about a physical campus walkthrough evaluation when I'm here to talk with you about online and remote learning? But the reasons why I'm bringing this up is because the practices involved in this ePortfolio equity evaluation that was brought to us by the student perspectives is something that we are currently working on in a digital environment. And I'll talk to you about that in a second. But what we had students do across a several year period of time after a full year in the first year general education program of participating in those autoethnography storytelling approaches with one another is actually evaluate the equity on their campus using 5 lenses. They provide qualitative and quantitative rankings supported by evidence, images, videos, and their perceptions of campus well-being and belonging from their own social identity. They did this as individuals, and they also did it in participation with peer discourse. And so if you are interested in taking a look at the early days of the campus equity walkthrough evaluation, there is a link to PDX Scholar in the lower right-hand corner. And we have since a link came out at PDX Scholar, written the chapter that we just discussed, and I think it would be good for you to see how it has progressed over the last 3 or 4 years. It's really nice to see kind of how our concepts of equity have shifted during the pandemic from before and after we began the CWE, which is what we call this. So the CWE, what were the outcomes from this campus equity walkthrough evaluation? We know that students absolutely identified racialized structures and practices on campus. We know that they were developing their self-reflection practices by using these lenses of equity to shape their reflections and connections around their feelings and social identities. We also saw evidence that they were re-examining their self in the self-reflection, and that they re-examined themselves and put themselves in position and alignment with others because of the communal reflection components. And then we leveraged those questions to help students describe their belonging, right? So it helps them determine how their sense of campus belonging is impacted by their individual and their collective understanding of racialized structures and practices. Since it was such a successful process for us, what we want to do now, and what we are doing, is working on the next generation of the CWE. And this is actually called SERVE, Student Equity in Remote and Virtual Environments. It's currently under development. And I want to say thank you to Kevin Kelly and the Peralta team in California for developing the Peralta Community College District online equity rubric. We are now retrofitting, there's a link here for you, that online equity rubric and molding it with that CWE model so that we can have our students take those lenses of equity and inclusion and think about how they're experiencing those now in our online and remote environments, the results of which we hope inform the way in which we design, shape, deliver, and participate in our fully online and remote experiences with our students. So the context of the CWE is going to lead me to the last thing that I share with you before we move into conversation this morning. So as I mentioned before, Portland State University is what I like to think of as a highly innovative university. We have been practicing reflection. I actually have a magnet on my fridge that says reflecting on reflection since 1994. And it cracks me up, but it's true. And the context of that campus equity walkthrough, it was facilitated in their 4-year university studies general education program. That philosophy there is that their inclusive, interdisciplinary, inquiry-based pedagogy wants to help provoke the students to build self-efficacy through learning across difference. And so here's a list of high impact practices below here that is generated by the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And I would not hesitate to say that university studies is participating in every single one of these, but the one at the bottom is the one I want to talk about now, which is the e-portfolio becoming the 11th high impact practice. The campus equity walkthrough evaluation itself was an e-portfolio. The students in their general education program also develop a year-long portfolio and manage and support their portfolios from the inception of their degree program until graduation in various forms across campus. So that e-portfolio for us is the quintessential high impact practice. And I'm putting in a couple other examples and resources here. So leveraging the e-portfolio from university to career in those online business programs that I showed you about was something we were doing in 2015, right? And this idea of e-portfolios also generating equity. Here's a little quote from our CWE article, that e-portfolios assist users in documenting their knowledge of equity mindedness. So the E in e-portfolio can also represent this equity for our learners. On the right-hand side of the slide, we have Leveraging the e-portfolio for Integrative Learning, which is a book by Dr. Candace Reynolds and Judith Patton. I also highly recommend you take a look at e-portfolios, which can be a really beneficial part of a course, but is an amazing way of tying together, surfacing learning and integrating learning at the program and degree level. So can't stop with the e-portfolios, can't say enough about them. Obviously, I'm a 20-year practitioner, but I reap the benefits of them. Just recently submitted my terminal degree doctoral portfolio at Portland State University, the first one ever submitted. E-portfolios are going nowhere. They're now at over 70% use in higher ed institutions, and I would encourage you to explore those. Gail mentioned a little earlier when we were chatting, the Association for Authentic and Evidence-Based Learning. I highly recommend, if you're interested in e-portfolios, you connect with that organization and see what some other e-portfolio practitioners are saying about the efficacy of portfolios for equity practices. So now that I have thrown the book at you, all the different practices that we covered today, I think what I'll do is head back to the key slide, one of the key slides at the beginning, so that I can maybe give you the opportunity to say, what did we just talk about? And is there anything that I have a question about, right? So we have, context, all these things. Go for it, Gail.
So Melissa, I think the biggest request and the biggest source of resources for everybody are the links that you've mentioned. I was able to share the Slicks video link and the Melissa Pete link, but there's so many fantastic links in your presentation. Are you happy to share your presentation?
Of course I will share I made it as a resource for you all.
Right.
You know, what I was hoping today is that I would throw out enough effective strategies that Gail and I get to participate in implementing, and that we see being successful, that we can have a conversation, and that these resources will inspire you to think about how we are talking about all of these topics and employing these designs with our scholars.
Great.
I would encourage you, if you want to, I know you're all probably drinking coffee in your pajamas like I am, but to have a conversation here with us if you would like to.
So any questions? What do you guys think? What are the challenges you're facing?
Eliza?
Hi. I sort of have like a question or just a thought that came to mind as you were talking about e-portfolios. I haven't used them myself in my teaching, but I was training faculty on how to use it in some programs at different universities. And, you know, when faculty were sort of given these courses that incorporated e-portfolios, it was hard to see all of the benefits that you were describing, how they were presented. So like without saying too, you know, getting too off track, like, you know, it was like very, really very prescriptive, what should be included. And it just seemed like maybe a collection of assignments that could have just been submitted to the LMS separately. And they were just kind of combined into this thing and they were calling it a portfolio.
Yes.
So I'm interested in the resource that you shared and potentially if you have any more about really thinking about expanding folks' understanding of what a portfolio really can be in relation to, you know, encouraging more equity in courses.
Yes. So the thing about a portfolio, and so you described what I think is a very important part of the development of folio thinking skills. So folio thinking actually does run from highly prescriptive at the beginning to fully creative and autonomous at the end. And the reason why that has to take place is because learning how to participate in reflective practice, how to collect and organize your own assets of learning, how to make connections across those, and then how to showcase those are a whole set of folio thinking skills. So I'm getting ready to teach a folio thinking faculty development course at College of the Canyons over the summer in California. But I think that what we're talking about are the habits of folio thinking and not the product of the portfolio. So when you think about helping and supporting faculty to do portfolio development, they don't necessarily need to be responsible for the entire portfolio. That belongs to the student. But we are responsible for helping them surface their learning, reflect, encouraging them to take responsibility for their own creative pieces of work, which they're right now throwing in an LMS and losing, right? So I think what we do often when we show up to implement the diffusion of innovation or e-portfolios on a campus, Gail and I, what we look for is where is reflective practice already happening? Where is integrative learning already happening? How are we encouraging our students to capture their own signature work? How are we supporting them to then make connections and understand audience development? Those components can exist without a faculty having to own the product of a portfolio. A portfolio can then be created in a free software or an intermediary platform. However, let's be aware of the ethics behind those, as I mentioned at the beginning of the platform. So I think a part of what we do is scaffold early prescriptive guided learning for the scholar in their first year around portfolio development, and then give them the tools, the privacy, the security, the encouragement, and the opportunities they need in the middle of their degree programs to be able to then generate showcase portfolios of learning. So it's a learning portfolio, prescriptive and guided, and then a showcase portfolio, audience specific and concluding. And in the middle part, I think faculty suffer from the inability to manage the workload of the whole portfolio for the student. This mindset that we have to manage things for them in the digital landscape is something we've been building on ourselves. We've been forcing ourselves to manage this for 15 years. So I think when we think about portfolio development, it's the skills, not just the products that you drop in a file. The actual definition, according to my colleague, Gail Ring here and Wendy Garrison, is that it is digital and it contains reflection. And that reflection is the context for the learner's experiences, evidence, and accomplishments. And so if it's just a repository of files, then that doesn't include, it doesn't actually meet the requirements in the definition of an e-portfolio. That's it.
Well,
Thank you so
I want
much.
to
Yeah,
add
that's so helpful.
Gail, yes, please.
Yeah, so sorry, Cheryl, didn't want to interrupt. Okay, so the other thing, I think the incredible power in the portfolio is in the process of the portfolio. And a lot of times it's used exactly as you're describing. It's either a bookend Students start it their first semester, they finish it their last semester, and nothing happens in the middle. So, you know, there's no continuity, there's no kind of rehearsal and practice and conversation and dialogue around that learning, around those reflections. I would argue, I would expand my definition that it's really not a portfolio unless you do engage in conversations around that learning. So, you know, to develop that habit of mind. Melissa and I could talk about portfolios.
We could.
Well,
I think too, I mean, not everyone has the benefit of a deeply entrenched portfolio development process on their campus, right? So because our general education program has hinged their gen ed program on reflective practice and integrative learning long before digital portfolios were even available, if we are doing those things for our scholars, even without the vehicle of the portfolio, we're still teaching them those habits. But here's an example of what I think amazing portfolio development looks like. In the University Studies program, they do a formative feedback on the portfolios across the whole year. Those portfolios represent the learning outcomes for their program, social justice, inquiry, those sorts of things. But at the end of each year, they do a summative review to take a look at what scholars are saying they learned in relation to those learning outcomes. A few years ago, these randomly sampled, I think 8,000 students a year use the portfolio development tool at PSU in the gen ed program. The random sampling of those actually illuminated a learning outcome that the program itself was unaware that it was teaching. The students provided enough evidence about what they were being exposed to across their degree program that when they went through the summative review of portfolios, they realized they'd actually been teaching an additional learning outcome that the students were sharing with them they were learning. That's the best case scenario, right? Our students are actually saying, here's what we're really experiencing in your courses, and they were able to adjust their learning outcomes to include this additional place-based learning social justice component. I mean, if we can have that strong of a formative dialogue with our students and summatively assess what they're learning to actually increase our learning outcomes based on their experiences, that's one of those amazing aha moments for portfolio development and equity in higher ed, I think. Other questions about self-grading or the digital concepts or policy and law? Online equity evaluation tools, anything else we can do with you this morning?
I love the idea of wait time, just to
I do
see.
too. I used to always say 16 seconds is the uncomfortable part. Yeah.
Yes. Eliza or anybody, again, Melissa and I, we've done a lot of work. We've done our own dissertations on ePortfolio implementation and innovation diffusion. So if you'd like more information, any resources, feel free to email Melissa or I. We're going to share Melissa's presentation with Cheryl, and she'll make sure that it gets out there. But my email is gail@pebblepad.com. It's very easy. And Melissa's is Melissa at PebblePad.
Oh, actually, I just put in the wrong one, but I'm also at Pirie at pdx.edu. Either way, and this is a lot to chew on. It's a lot of ideas. It really was meant to kind of be a buffet of concepts that we can think about using and applying. But I hope that you can see that there is data and research behind all of these practices that we put forward today. And I'm actually pleasantly pleased to see so many people here in pursuit of equity and engagement with our learners. What a lovely conference it's been. I've really enjoyed seeing many of you present and digest lots of great information on how we are designing and delivering our fully online experiences. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for bringing forward digital citizenship and the importance of what all this means to students today. Just looking at those maps that you showed at the very beginning. Well, can you remind us of the years of the first one?
Yeah. I have my undergraduate is geography and geology. So those maps, I never don't think in maps, right? Because I'm a geographer. So 1999, and in fact, why don't I drop a Google image in there? It's called the Cheswick Mapping Project. And it's an internet map, and it was one of the first ones. It's a millisecond of internet activity. So here we go. And it was Bill Cheswick, and I will just drop this in the chat for everyone. Then then after this is one of the first ones, but after this, you can just Google internet maps, activity maps, and you'll see all kinds of cool new ones. So there's a link to Bill's initial one. And this one included 100,000 nodes in 1999. So now there's, millions of nodes everywhere. But what I love about those maps is they represent real relationships.
Right.
Those little lines is you and me right now, right? The little lines are you and my learner. And then all those hubs of all those intermediary companies that are managing Lord knows what. So that's fun too.
Well, digital citizenship was something I had to do a technology plan for 5 years when I first came to Ames. And that was one of the top things that I brought forward to the administration there, is that we need to be talking to students about this so that they really understand their relationship with not just the curriculum that they're working in and their programs that they're trying to earn, but also just their relationship with technology and what it means today. Because I'm so glad you also shared that slide on how old of a product that we're sitting on top of in terms of, we're using an outdated system to help guide us through the 21st century with technology, when this technology wasn't even in somebody's mind really back in 1893 when it first started.
And I think Dr. Cory Doctorow makes the argument in his book that ambiguity is on purpose. The ambiguity of law allows for digital colonialism to exist. Right. One of the other things that I didn't mention in this, but he does mention in the book, is that every first world country in the world considers the internet a human right, but we consider it a public utility in the United States. So it's not protected as a human right. So it's just fascinating to think about how we are exposing our students to this concept of the place they go, and how, if they thought about it more as a place, would they behave as if it's a physical space with one another.
Right. But we could be teaching it in all of our courses too, to some degree, I think. Bringing it forward in almost every single course that we teach.
Could.
There are, maybe a few, but
we could. But I think too, and for those of you that are still left over here, I have to say that managing faculty workload has been a full-time job for me. Right, supporting faculty training and development for many years in online degrees is important. What I think is tricky about many of these things is that they live everywhere, but no one takes ultimate responsibility for them. And because that's why I like to show KPU's ecosystem. They're trying to take central responsibility for modeling this so that every faculty doesn't have to do it on their own ad hoc, right? Because if we all have to take responsibility for orienting our learners to this digital landscape and digital citizenship, and that took up 10% of all of our classes, why is it not a required part of our liberal education degrees? So that we all don't have to, it's almost like everybody brought sugar for the pie, but we don't have the oven, so yeah.
Or the rest of the pie making.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. We are just a few minutes over time, so thanks again for attending.
Thanks for facilitating
on the last day. And we will make sure that you get access to those slides. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Enjoy your day.
Bye.